All right, in chapter 14, we get a chance to talk about Gregor Mendel, the father of modern day genetics, and his experiments and what we learn in terms of the field of genetics from what he had accomplished as a scientist. And so as humans, we're always curious about why is it that I am the way that I am, right? Why am I short? Why am I tall? Why do I have brown hair and why do I have blue eyes, etc. And humans have been curious about this for a really long time. And we have done many studies by many scientists looking at how traits are passed from parent to offspring. And it used to be that there were two hypotheses that scientists would subscribe to. One of these genetics hypotheses was the blending hypothesis. And this was the idea that genetic material from two parents sort of blends together. This is very similar to mixing paint, right? If you take blue paint and yellow paint, you're going to end up making green paint. The other hypothesis was a hypothesis called the particulate hypothesis. And this was a little bit different. And this was an idea that parents were passing on discrete but heritable units to their offspring. We now know that we have built up more data to support this particulate hypothesis. And these, what we called discrete heritable units, are actually genes that are found as part of our DNA, as part of our genome. So when we talk about genetics and we talk about, these two hypotheses and the data that support the particulate hypothesis over the blending hypothesis, we definitely have to talk about this individual by the name of Gregor Mendel. Now, Gregor Mendel was a monk. He lived in a monastery, but on top of being a religious individual, he was also a scientist, and he was in charge of tending to the monastery's garden. Right, so the garden would feed the monks, and not only did Mendel used this garden as a source of nutrition, but he also used it as his scientific laboratory, as he was a geneticist. And he had chosen plants to be his model organisms so that he could see, well, if I cross this kind of plant to this kind of plant, what kind of offspring do I get? How are certain characters passed on from one generation to the next? And so before we start talking about Mendel and his experiments, there are a couple of new vocabulary terms perhaps that we need to introduce. So first of all, we've got a character. A character is going to be a heritable feature that varies among individuals, such as flower color, if we're thinking about Mendel's experiments and the fact that he used plants. You can apply this to any living organism, though. Humans, for example, a character could be hair color, or a character could be eye color. And for each character, you have traits. A trait is going to be a variant for a particular character. So when Mendel was looking at flower color, he chose to work with peas, and peas come in two different flower color varieties. And there's either the white trait or there's the purple trait. If we were to apply this idea of a trait to humans, right, we talk about character being eye color, a trait would be blue eyes and brown eyes and hazel eyes. Or if your character is hair color, then the traits would be blonde hair and brown hair and red hair and black hair and so on and so forth. Now, Mendel, again, he chose to use plants as his model organisms, and specifically he picked the garden pea. And either he was really lucky or really smart, maybe a combination of both, but the garden pea was a really good genetic model to use for a variety of different reasons. First of all, there were many varieties available, so he could pick and choose. Oh, this pea is a little bit different from this pea plant. Let's cross them together and see what happens. The generation time was also pretty short, so he could grow a lot of peas in a short period of time to collect a lot of data. The more data you have, the more confident you can be in the conclusions that you make from the data that you analyze. On top of that, peas produce a lot of offspring. So if we take a look at the picture on this particular slide, here we have an example of a pea flower. if that flower is pollinated, meaning that the eggs in that flower get fertilized, each egg will develop into a pea in one of these pea pods. And now pea flowers, or pea plants, let's say, they produce multiple flowers, each one having the ability to produce a pod, and that pod having multiple peas, each one being an individual offspring in it. One plant can produce a lot of offspring at the same time, again increasing the amount of data that could be collected, which is a great thing in science. And then lastly, he could actually control the mating. He could pick and choose which plants were crossed to which other plant. Let's take a look at how this is done. You may not be familiar with the structure of a pea flower, so let's go through it. So pea flowers, as shown here, they actually have both male and female parts. So a complete flower that's mature would have the ability to pollinate itself. So let's take a look at the male and the female parts. The female part is called the carpel, and it's sort of this fatter stem with a bulge down here at the bottom. At the bottom here where the carpel is, this is where the eggs are stored, and they sort of wait there until they get fertilized by the sperm. The male part of the flower are called stamen, and they are these thinner little filaments here with kind of a little bulge on the top. The bulge on the top is where the pollen grains are produced, and the pollen grains are what make the sperm cells. And so if you were to take some of the pollen from the stamen and touch the pollen to the tip of the carpel, the sperm then would have a chance to get to the inside of the carpel where the eggs are, fertilize the eggs, and create those new peas or the new offspring for the next generation. Now, sometimes Mendel wanted a pea plant to pollinate itself, and so he would do nothing except let that pea, right, have its stamen coming into contact with the carpel and self-pollinate, and then he would be able to see what the offspring would be like. But in some cases, that's not what he wanted, and he wanted to actually cross-pollinate two different plants of different varieties to see what the resulting offspring would look like. And so in this case, he had to make sure that a plant didn't have the ability to pollinate itself. And so what he would do is he would take a pea flower that was beginning to mature, and before the stamen, the pollen-producing male part of the flower, had the ability to mature, he would cut the stamen off. And so he would essentially cut off all those tiny little stems, and he would leave just the carpel. So in this case, this flower now only has female parts, and it cannot self-pollinate. So the only way for the eggs in the carpel there to become fertilized would be for him or somebody to come along and introduce some pollen grains from a different plant to the tip of the carpel, and therefore cross-pollinate this flower with the sperm from another plant to fertilize the eggs on the inside of the carpel. All right, now again, Mendel was either really smart, lucky, or a combination of the two, in that he chose to track characters in these pea plants that occurred only in two distinct alternative forms, meaning there were only two traits per character. For example, for flower color, peas only have two options. They're either white or they're purple. Makes things really easy. Later on, you'll see that he looked at other characters. Again, he always chose to track those characters that only had two options for simplicity's sake. All right, as we start talking about Mendel's crosses, or the initial experiments that he did using these pea plants, we have to understand where he started from. So in his initial cross, Mendel chose to use varieties of these peas that are what we call true breeding. A true breeding plant is one that, if left to self-pollinate, will only produce offspring that look exactly like it. So for example, this purple flower, if this pea plant is true breeding, that means if this purple flower were left to self-pollinate, it would only produce offspring that could make purple flowers. On the other hand, this white flower right here, if it was a true breeding white flower and it was left to self-pollinate, it would only be able to produce pea offspring that make also white flowers. So he started with these true breeding variety peas in his what we call pea generation or parental generation, his very first cross. So here we've got an example of Mendel's first hybridization experiments, where he was going to cross two true breeding flowers that differed in that one character. So he's got a true breeding purple flower that he's crossing to a true breeding white flower. When he crossed those and the resulting offspring that he got, this generation was his what we call F1 or first filial generation, and these were the hybrids. They were the cross between the white and the purple flower. And what he noticed is that all of the F1 generation hybrids, they were all purple. He said, well, that's curious, right? Took a white flower, purple flower, crossed them, and got all purple flowers. Where did the white flower go? So he wasn't satisfied with this particular result. He said, okay, well, let's take it one step further to see, if we can deduce something about where this white flower color went. And so he took then these F1 generation hybrids and he crossed them to themselves. This could have been self-pollination or cross-pollination. It didn't really matter because these were all the same. And so he got the resulting offspring. This would produce his F2 generation or his second filial generation. And he noticed a very interesting result. For every 3 purple flowers, he would get 1 white flowered pea. So now he had a puzzle on his hands. He had to try to figure out, well, what happened? Why do I get this interesting result that for every 3 purples, I get that 1 white flower in my F2 generation?